Welcome to LinkedUp, Breaking Boundaries in Education, a podcast that focuses on what is happening in education today, connecting everyone to the movers and shakers that are breaking boundaries in the education arena.
Well, hello. Welcome back to LinkedUp, Breaking Boundaries in Education. Jerry, we've had several podcasts on design thinking, and we are always intrigued about it, and we are always learning something new. But I think we both agree that it tends to be challenging to implement it in education. Why is it such a struggle? And
Right.
I think it's so imperative for innovation. So I'm looking forward to digging into that today.
Yes.
Sure.
Today we have with us Sheryl Cababa, and she is the Chief Design Officer at a place called Substantial. I love the name of your company, Substantial. That's awesome. Yes, and she is going to talk to us about something, I don't think I know much about equity centered design. So, Sheryl, first of all, welcome. We're glad you're here from Seattle today, and we are looking forward to the conversation. Can you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and what equity centered design is all about?
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here and talking with both of you. And I can talk a little bit about my background as a design researcher and strategist. And so I'm somebody who has worked within sort of the design thinking space now for a few decades. And the idea is that, design can be a tool to create solutions, and they are focused pretty much primarily on who is going to be using your end products, and gaining the sort of empathy to be able to design best for them. And the idea is that if you design best for them, for your end users, that your product will be successful in other ways as well. Because people love to use great products. And so now that I'm working pretty much exclusively in education, we have sort of an approach that sort of jumps off of design thinking. And what we call human-centered design is another word for design thinking, because you're thinking about the humans who are going to be using your products. And we've sort of shifted into kind of like an adjacent kind of practice called equity centered design. And that's really oriented around not just focusing on designing for your end users, um, but it's also kind of thinking about who out of your end users are kind of most marginalized in the existing system. Like, who is the worst off, and how can you better design for them? And also, while you're kind of engaging in that process, kind of thinking about yourself and your own privileges and where you come from and the assumptions that you have. And what this entails is really working really directly in community with those who you are designing for. So in our case, we're oftentimes working with students throughout our processes. And we're working with students, let's take multilingual learners, for example, students who are coming into school without English as their first language. And one of the things that, you know, we feel is relevant here is that if you design best for them, other students will also benefit.
Right.
And so making sure they're part of the process, and then also being really focused on them. So it's this combination of human-centered design and equity that allows us to kind of best design for everyone at the end of the day.
That's funny because I don't remember if it was another guest or hearing it somewhere else, but the idea was that the dips in the sidewalk, right? In order for people to walk in the crosswalk, what are they called? They were
Curb
designed
cuts.
curb cut. Okay.
Yeah.
So they were designed specifically for people with wheelchairs, but don't we all take advantage of those? Is
That's
that
right.
similar concept?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually use curb cuts a lot as a really good
Oh, okay.
example of designing for equity. So I love that you brought that up. I also talk about things like subtitling on movies and
Yeah.
yeah, right. Like
Uh-huh.
I watch movies with subtitles on all the time, and it's like,
Exactly.
yeah, I don't have hearing loss, but it's like that's who
Oh,
it's
oh,
initially designed for. But many of us others in terms of like our varying contexts also benefit from it.
right.
So those are all both really good examples in adjacent spaces of like how you can design best with inclusion in mind and for those who have the most need, but everyone else benefits.
And
Yeah.
the subtitles example is actually really specific to my family. My daughter does have hearing loss. She needs those on because sometimes either the language is too fast or there are maybe accents. So it really is helpful to her. And then it made me realize when they were on, when she even wasn't there, oh, I actually really can really benefit from this much more as well. So same idea. Yeah, I love that. So that's human. So that's equity centered design that feeds into human centered design.
Can you give us an example of something that you've done in the educational space?
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting. Even though my background is in sort of digital product design, the
Sure.
space that my team most works in right now is working with those who are kind of funding solutions in education and
Huh?
using human centered design to and equity centered design to inform that. So what we're doing is trying to ensure that, for example, student voice is part of the investments that large philanthropies are making in education. So we work, for example, quite often with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So one example is a project that we worked on recently. Philanthropies like the Gates Foundation uh, oftentimes put out grand challenges. So these are challenges to the field to kind of solve for specific things within a domain. And a grand challenge we worked on was called Balance the Equation. Was an Algebra 1 grand challenge. The idea is that Algebra 1 is a gateway course for students. But there are a lot of students, specifically, for example, Black and Latino students, oftentimes get tracked into other math spaces in which they don't get exposed to algebra early enough, and then that puts them off track in terms of college readiness. And so the Gates Foundation put together a grand challenge, and our role in that was trying to figure out like where are the avenues, where are the points of leverage points where we can solve for this problem. And so we talked to teachers, we talked to students about their experiences with algebra. And then at the end of the day, there wasn't really one spot where you could kind of intervene. There were multiple, like, for example, professional development for teachers, making sure content and pedagogy was culturally relevant for, different types of students. Um, Also, sort of like community based programs that that basically help students navigate math. And what they ended up doing was funding kind of different things in these different areas that would help kind of like achieve the outcomes that they were seeking. So I know this is not like a very like direct or, it's not like, oh, we designed this product and then it turned out, it worked for everybody. But a lot of times, like that's where the decision making happens. And our role is to make sure like students and teachers are heard in that context and that they're able to kind of talk about the complexity of the system as it stands and where the potential problem solving opportunities are. So yeah, we really take our role seriously on my team as like those who are kind of facilitating the dialogue between those who are in the classroom and those who are kind of like funding different ideas within the space that will affect them.
Education is so complicated because
Mhm.
it's about people. And so rarely is there a silver bullet that will fix any problem.
That's right.
And you usually have to attack it on several prongs to
Yeah.
be able to, fix the problem if you can. Um, I've noticed too, you talk a lot about storytelling. How does that work into the equity centered design?
Yeah, it's one of those aspects that I think I feel like in the field as we're like problem solving within
Mhm.
education, maybe we don't think about enough just because a lot of times, you know, decisions are made based on like quantitative data that
Right,
is like these numbers of students are, excelling in this space and these students are not, which has a role, right? Because then you can kind of decide where the problems are.
right,
But yeah, as we're working as I work directly with students and teachers, for example, it is really kind of like understanding their context. A lot of times in research, we call that thick data. So, big data is like looking at things sort of numerically across, statistically across populations. And thick data is kind of like understanding context and just kind of like understanding someone's situation and so really, basically kind of targeting student populations who fell into that category that we would oftentimes call priority students. So like the students we felt like were our priority from an equity perspective and who aligned with like, sort of like the teams that we work with, their priorities. So sometimes, as I mentioned before, that could be like multilingual learners. It could be Black and Latino students. It could be students experiencing poverty and so we would spend a lot of time with these students and with the teachers who are in classrooms with them and kind of like understand the context around their classroom experience. Um, and what that looks like in terms of our engagement with them means it looks very different than like traditional forms of research where even qualitative research where you're interviewing people about specific things. But we try to get at that, especially because we're working with students, anyone from middle school students to post secondary students. We use what we call sort of projective techniques. So that means um, activities that they can do that sort of surface maybe the problem space or opportunity areas. And it might mean things like, yeah, create a little like journal of your typical day, take some pictures and kind of like pop that in. And then we'll talk about it when we meet. So it might be like some pre work that somebody does, or make a vision board about where you see yourself in 10 years and these are really good, not only good context for us to have, but they're also very good like connection points for us and like the students that we work with to be able to share more of themselves about just like the things that matter to them and not just like, so what is algebra? What's your algebra class like? And that allows us to kind of contextualize all of that. And so we use that to kind of like interpret and also tell stories about their experiences in ways that, can kind of support the insights that we're taking away from working with them in that sort of like qualitative sense. Um, and also, we're mindful of like trying to make this worth their while too. So, like, trying to make it fun and interesting and learning a little bit about like how design research works is oftentimes really interesting to the students we work with. And so we want it to be reciprocal experience.
right.
I love
Yes.
that concept of the reciprocal experience. I love the deep research you're doing, the connectedness with the students to really, have that as a basis. My daughter's an industrial design major right now.
Oh,
Yeah, so she's designing a toy for a 4-year-old. Had to come up with many ideas, like 30 or 40, and then narrow it down. But she didn't do a lot of research. She just did it based on her knowledge of her cousins. But that connectedness, I think, is so important. But you also do research and based on collaboration. How does collaboration play a role in design thinking and so forth?
yeah, I love that question because I think oftentimes design research can be, what we call extractive. So where it feels like, oh yeah, we are gathering people's stories and their contexts and their way they perceive problems. And then we're going off and designing something for them that they'll eventually see who knows when. And what we like to do, so we do that, we try to understand the context. But then we also bring them in for what we call ideation. So kind of like thinking about how we can sort of problem solve together when it comes to the things that we identified. And so if we're, if a prompt for ideation is thinking about like, how can, how can math, what can we do to make math more relevant for you? Um, and have like activities or workshop together with students or with students and teachers where they're kind of like dreaming up new ways of sort of problem solving. And we try to like make it really open ended. Like we don't put constraints on it. Like you don't have to be thinking about what's feasible right away. Oftentimes those can be like the inquiries of like, oh, this is like the direction that somebody who's maybe building ed tech products should go. Um, or somebody who's kind of like designing curricula should go. And it's really great because I think it's a nice experience to be called into like the actual problem solving piece and not just being kind of used to understand what the problems are. So that's a really important part of like the equity center design process is like ensuring that you are sort of like integrating with the communities and like engaging people at every step of the process. So it's not happening kind of like in a vacuum. And also involving them, empowering people who are not usually empowered through the design process to be part of the design process.
Right. I would think the more people you have involved, the
True.
more unique perspectives that you have lead to better design in the long run. To get new thinking in there. 'Cause sometimes it's hard for students and educators to think differently because they grew up in this system. They've been working in the system
Yeah.
and it's really hard to break out of that.
Yeah, yeah. We recently did so we sometimes do projects that are focused on like futurism and like
Mm.
what we call speculative design, which is like just thinking about the future and how it's going to play out. And we've been doing a project recently around like imagining the future of math and having sort of high school students work with us on that. And it's interesting kind of like giving them a scenario that's like 20 years out, that's kind of like, oh, this is how we're imagining. Let's imagine like school is very community based. And they're, like we're trying to sort of prompt them to think about how technology would be used like 20
Right.
years from now. And when it comes to things like AI, it's like students like weren't afraid to kind of like think about like what their fears were around that, like how um that those sorts of systems might kind of like reduce me to something that I shouldn't be reduced to. But they're also like really imaginative about like how do we make sure that someone like me who looks like me is part of building those systems
Oh,
so that, maybe like school is oriented around teaching us how to build our own technology systems so that we can basically ensure that the biases that might exist against me today when these systems are being developed doesn't exist because then I'm sort of in control of it. And the way they sort of just like are so imaginative about that is really different than how like educators in the same kind
yes.
of workshop picture things, right?
Yes.
And so I love that contrast. But you have to kind of take both away because like these are people who are having to collaborate and operate together like within our classrooms today.
So
Right. So you have
taking
to find
all stakeholders into consideration always.
That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah. And it's a form of systems thinking, which is something we also do. And
Right. Okay. 'Cause
um,
the book
yeah.
was based on systems thinking, right?
yeah,
So,
yeah.
and so your book is called, I don't know if we said it before, Closing the Loop: Systems Thinking for Designers. So really that's what systems thinking is really taking into consideration all stakeholders, all the systems that come into play, say for instance in education or any other institution.
Yeah, I love that connection because I think oftentimes systems thinking is kind of just like thinking about like systemic forces or trying to analyze and understand systemic forces. And I feel like where it sort of feels a little bit less humanizing,
Mhm.
because it's kind of like an abstraction of, what happens and how people behave. And I think what you're saying about like consider all stakeholders is such a core tenet of doing systems thinking correctly and involving the stakeholders in decision making.
Right.
And that those are ways of like ensuring that you're engaging systems thinking within your problem solving. And education is a space that, it's systems thinking. There's kind of this term wicked problems, which is like, yeah, what are the problems that are entrenched, kind of complex, that don't have any sort of singular solution? And it's education is one of those, right? Healthcare is another one.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yes.
yeah. And I think part of that is that there's so many layers of decision making. There's so many different stakeholders who have varying incentives. And anytime you engage in just like design processes or in design thinking, you need to be taking all of these different stakeholders and their incentives under consideration. And I think that happens like where sometimes designers are not conscious of that. So, like, if you can imagine, like, designing and developing an ed tech product, like, let's say you're like creating some sort of like, um, I don't know, just like supplement, like digital supplement to be used in a classroom. Um, I think sometimes you think like, oh yeah, that'll be like a really good solution. We just need to test it with students. And then you find out, yeah, this is not compatible with IT systems like within schools, or
Right.
there's certain budgets that are allocated in a certain way, and that's not going to fit for major school districts. Or, there's like 89 different languages within the school district. And have you thought about that in terms of your product? And then what are the policies in
Right.
the state that you might want this product to be used? And so these are all potential barriers to a solution being effective. And so why I wrote the book around systems thinking specifically for designers is like taking the system into account before and as you're designing things is
Yeah.
really important in order for what you're designing to be successful.
Yeah, before, during, and after, not just after you've done it.
That's right.
And not just and I there's what I'm hearing from you is that there is a difference between taking stakeholders into consideration through systems thinking, but also actually bringing them in and having conversations with them because and when you're doing that, it eliminates the assumptions. And I think there are a
Yeah.
lot of assumptions that probably are huge barriers.
Yeah. I was working on another project recently about assessments in early childhood education. And it was really great because like the one of the things that we did, we worked as well with a partner organization, MDRC, which is kind of like a policy institution. Um, we talked to policymakers in different states about like what does it mean to change the nature of early childhood assessment. And that was like just like a really important sort of touch point within our project because we had started with talking to preschool teachers and families and school administrators, but like kind of getting sort of this like overarching lens from the policymakers and those who are involved at the state level was just like another lens that absolutely needed to be taken into consideration because you can't just like change assessments as though it's going to happen
Right.
in a vacuum. You need to
Right.
talk to them and like get a sense of like, well, how would you imagine, um, what do you imagine these solutions could look like? And I think, yeah, having all of those people who are at different levels of decision making as part of project will help you kind of like understand what will be successful and what are the other levers that are needed in order for a change to be successful.
Right.
Yeah.
And personalized learning is kind of the buzzword in education right now. How do you balance that, finding solutions and keeping things personalized to the student as well? Is that difficult?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's personalized learning is one of those things that's kind of like, I don't know. I think that's like an evidence based sort of like pedagogy, right? That a lot of people are trying to figure out, how do we implement this well? How do we have like products that kind of
Yeah.
support this in a way? And yeah, I mean, I think part of it, and from a designer's perspective, I think part of it is like recognizing the patterns and how students like collectively experience
Right.
um, kind of learning. And then, yeah, really kind of like testing and iterating to sort of figure out where are the avenues to integrate this personal learning. So, or personalized learning within like products, for example. And I think like, I don't know, I wasn't like planning on talking about AI, but I do think like there's some avenues and kind of like emerging technologies specifically around AI that can facilitate that. And part of it, like as you're designing these kinds of products, is I do believe in like sort of the iterative process of human-centered design and design thinking, is kind of like prototyping things and testing them with students and teachers like in real classroom environments, and then iterating on it to make
Mhm.
sure you get it right. So I don't know if I don't think that's specific to personalized learning per se, but it's like
Right.
applicable to like any form of like sort of problem solving that you're doing, especially like with digital technologies that you're kind of integrating in the classroom.
Right. And I would think that the equity work you do too kind of feeds into personalized learning, making sure that all students see themselves in what you're doing and how you're moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's just like a good reminder again that there are things that you can do for the students who maybe have the greatest challenges.
Mhm.
Um, and designing for them will help others benefit. So, for example, we know from research that like discourse based instruction in math works really well with like multilingual learners in kind of like, um, giving them sort of like the tools of language and the tools of math kind of like in together. And what you realize is like other students like really benefit from that as well. You don't have to just be like a multilingual learner. And so that can be kind of like they maybe that's something that ends up being invested then in like sort of teacher professional development, is like how can you engage in more like this discourse based instruction in a way that's effective and that will like benefit um maybe like the majority of your students. And so kind of like taking that approach, I think like personalized learning, I mean, I wish I could like answer a little bit more specifically about that. But I do think kind of like designing for those students who are kind of at the most marginalized end of the
Sure.
spectrum definitely benefits other students as well.
Yes.
So
And
like,
like
so
you said earlier, it's multifaceted.
yeah,
So
Absolutely.
yes.
yeah, for sure. So I know that when you've been talking about equity centered research and how ultimately it empowers the end user. What are those specific principles? There are 8, right? Principles for equity centered research.
Yeah, I wrote about this at one point and then they kind of like shift and evolve, but I think there's a few that are really constant for us. And feel really different than just doing traditional forms of research. So we oftentimes like when we're working with different populations of students, we try to ensure that there is somebody of our team who has a shared lived experience. So if we're working with Black and Latino students, like making sure that we have somebody who's like a cultural moderator who may have like
Mhm.
similar lived experiences, like in the classroom or maybe as an educator. And so that's one tenet we go by, is like make sure that you have like representation on your team or have like a cultural moderator. We have multilingual learners, somebody who has experience with multilingual
I
learning
like
or
that.
has been a teacher in that space. Other things that we do is like oftentimes like you have like research participants who we already like try to flip the dynamic a little bit by calling them lived experts rather than research participants. Because
Okay.
honestly, like without their expertise, we couldn't do our work. So we make sure like they also know that we call them lived experts. And um, I think part of it is like we don't come in with like the neutrality of like I'm a researcher and I just like need to understand like these particular aspects about like your life or your experience. um, we also kind of like share our own experiences. So if we're working, for example, like, we were recently working with post-secondary students, some of them who had kind of dropped out of school and were kind of like trying to understand their experiences and, just having somebody on our research side who could share their own experience with like um, maybe their kind of like convoluted path through like post-secondary education really opens doors with our with those who we're kind of like interviewing because it's like, oh, like they're not just like coming in here trying to like capitalize on my trauma or something like that.
Right,
um
right.
like they're actually trying to like involve me in this process.
Sure. Yeah.
um and I think it's like that's like a really important piece of it is that there's something reciprocal. I think like out of the principles, a lot of them are really about reciprocity. So it's
Yeah.
kind of like making sure that they're getting something out of it. Are there other ways we can help you? Like one of the things like we've heard from students is like sometimes we'll be kind of doing this work and they're kind of like, how do we get to do what you do? Like, what do I
Sure.
need to study? Like,
Right.
where do I need to go to school? I've never heard of this as a job. And so, like, being able to like help them from a resources perspective of like understanding that, or just like anything else, like networking, connections. We also like, this is like unstated as sort of like our equity principles around like, conducting research, but like we also pay our participants really well because like we're kind of like, again,
Mhm.
we couldn't do this work without their expertise.
Valuing their work. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, oftentimes it's kind of like, oh, you know what? I'll take like the learning or mentoring or networking over, you know, basically like just being paid for this interview. And like we always pay them for the interview. Like that's not an option, but it's like, yeah, we'll do this other stuff for you too. Um, and I think like, that is an aspect of like treating participants as experts. Like that's
Mhm.
just kind of like, yeah, there's usually a dynamic in research here where we're just like extracting as much as possible out of you. And then we just kind of like don't even tell you what we're doing the research for. And then we just kind of like push you out the door.
Right.
Thank you very much. And I think this is like part of how we try to disrupt those kinds of cycles. And also it's helpful because we do work where we also try to build student advisory panels. And that's another like way of disrupting the power structure is like
Sure.
not just calling them research participants, but they can also end up being advisors to like ed tech teams and things like that. And I think
That's
that is
wonderful.
like a really nice way for them to be involved
Yeah.
in the process that empowers them to kind of like, yeah, again, actively engage in the design process.
It's all
Yeah.
part of that human centered approach. Yeah.
It's kind of hard to balance the AI and the personal touch. And so, making sure that kids are involved in all of the discussions and that they're seen and heard and that you understand what their needs are is very important as we move forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are the top wicked problems in education from your perspective?
Oh gosh, that's such a good question. Like nobody has asked me that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. One of the big ones is just the imbalance of resource distribution.
Oh,
So
yes.
one thing that we learned
Mhm.
during COVID is like some kids do
Yeah.
not even have access to the
Mm.
internet.
Right.
And everybody was sent home, and we had like students sitting in McDonald's parking lots trying to
Yeah.
do their work. And that is just completely unacceptable from an equity perspective. Um, and so I think that is like, at least in the US, like
Mm.
maybe in many ways, the core wicked problem in my mind is like we don't have an equal education system.
Yeah.
Um, and oftentimes, when we're working with and talking to ed tech teams, for example, we're kind of like, and they tell us like, oh, we've been like testing our product. And we're like, who are you testing your product with? Well, the school down the street. And it's like a suburban school that has tons and tons of resources, has really good funding. And we're like, oh, why don't you try it in this other school that's in the least affluent area of your city and kind of like see what happens there. And oftentimes it's a huge surprise to be like, oh my gosh, yeah, like students don't have devices there. And maybe they have like spotty internet access because of the area it's in. And uh, like there's a lot more inconsistency in the teaching staff because there's more turnover of teachers. And I think it's just like testing in those environments is so like eye opening for a lot of organizations that they realize like they might be like off the mark in terms of like being able to actually design for students who have the most need. So I would
Right.
say that the biggest wicked problem is resource distribution.
I would
Yeah.
agree.
Yeah.
I
Me
would,
too.
and I would
Absolutely.
pair that with um, not only access to resources, but access to opportunities too.
Yes. Yeah.
Seeing,
Yeah.
both ways be
Yeah.
served.
And I think maybe, because you mentioned that the pandemic kind of shed light on some of these, which was a silver lining that we often talk about. Um, but I think it goes back to what I mentioned before, the assumptions that we often make get in the way of progress. So,
That's right.
yeah, I mean, we really have to make sure that we are connecting, we're asking the right questions and asking the right people in order to progress and move forward. And especially in the name of equity for all. Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
So, where do you see education going in the next 10 years?
What is your lens into the future with the excitement and the innovation that you're working in?
Yeah, I think one, like trying to continue solving for the inequitable distribution of resources, I think is number
Mhm.
one. Two, I think having a really principled idea of how to use and deploy new technology. So I think
Yeah.
some of the things we're seeing right now is just like there is a lot of both fear and fervor about AI, for example.
Oh, I love
I
that fervor.
yeah, I teach in a university here in Washington, and it's really kind of interesting just how upset a lot of instructors are about students using AI for writing and things like that, right? And like students in high school and even middle school are doing this at this point. And
Right.
part of my prompt for that is like, not how do we catch cheaters who are using AI, but how do we think about flipping education in a way where we accept that that's being you. I mean, there's like nothing you can do. There's no AI detector that can kind of keep up with,
Right.
the large language models. So how do we kind of figure out how to test knowledge in a way that isn't sort of dependent on these outputs where students can kind of use AI in order to like show that they've learned something. And that might mean more kind of like dialogue based
Yes.
instruction in a way that we're not used to, right? So I'd
Right. And
love
again,
to see that.
instruction and assessment, authentic
Yeah.
assessment. So
Yeah.
why not make research from AI a mandatory tool. So you have a primary source, you have an internet source, you
Yeah.
have, like, and you have an AI source. It's a
Right.
must, right? And they use that information and synthesize it all in order to come up with their own findings. So it really just needs to be embraced. And I always say this. I always think back when we introduced the internet in education in the 90s, there was this similar fear, but instead it's not going anywhere. We learned how to embrace it and really leverage it, obviously, and utilize it in the classroom, and it just needs to be the same thing. So, I'm
Yeah.
hoping after a year from now, or or at some point, we will we'll have had accepted it and found really innovative ways to leverage it because it's changing our lives now, and it's going to change it even more. Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think it's just like, yeah, how can we imagine a future where this is a benefit to us, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I think, and I think part of that is like also taking a critical lens to who's developing it and why. So it's like if
Yeah.
people who have very little, like a very limited life experience are developing it and for profit motives, that's something we fundamentally should be questioning.
There.
It's
Right.
interesting. I saw an article the other day about how um, LA is leveraging AI to help using predictive analytics to kind of figure out who is going to potentially slide into homelessness and give them assistance before it happens. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so used to hearing predictive analytics being used to like punish people and to like, basically harm like those who are most marginalized. And this was like really eye opening in terms of like, here's how you can use, because humans can't keep up with that. Like, that
Right.
idea of like, how can we see which citizen has the patterns that might like indicate like, are they about to be evicted? Are they having trouble paying their bills? Like, if these are things that we can see, then you can be given assistance so that that doesn't happen. And it's just kind of like, oh my gosh, it's really refreshing to actually see it being used
AI for good. AI
in
for
a
good.
humanist
Yeah.
way. Yeah.
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 Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, this has been so informative. I love what you're doing, the work that you're doing, and making sure all perspectives are being heard as we move forward. So, one of the questions we always like to ask our guests is, in all of the work that you've done and you've been in this business for years, what has become clear to you?
Oh gosh. That's such a good question. Um, I mean, there's so many ways I could answer this, but one of them is like, always ask what people's incentives are.
Yes.
Because
I
if you
like that.
understand people's incentives, you understand their behavior. And if you understand their behavior, then you can kind of design for it, right? Um, whether it's good or bad, whether their incentives are helpful or whether their incentives are not in the right place at all. At the very least, understanding that helps you design things better. And yeah, I think it's like a good example of that is just like one of the things I was going to say to your previous question about like 10 years in the future, like where do you want to be? And one of the things I was going to say, which seems like a small thing, but I think is actually a big thing, is that formative assessments are used for being formative and not being used for like funding, that are not being used to
Yeah.
punish people. Um,
Right.
and it's funny how rare that is because like they can be misused in so many ways. And I think that's a good example of incentives because it's a really easy way to do an assessment, figure out whether a school deserves funding or not, based on that, even if it's meant to help teachers improve, even if it's meant to help students improve, it's like that's what it's being used for. It's being used to judge and punish and
Right.
yeah, and basically evaluate. Um, and I think like that's a good example of like understand what people's incentives are. Like that's something like I've learned that we always have to try to figure out, even if people themselves don't know what their incentives are, you can
Sure.
do systems analysis and figure it out.
Yeah, that is very profound.
Yeah.
I'm going to think about that all evening. That's really good. I like that.
Anytime you see decision making that seems out of whack, just go like, what's that individual's incentives? Like,
Yeah.
what are they being
Yeah,
incentivized to do?
That's
It
the
can be
heart of it.
pretty eye opening. Yeah.
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
eye opening. Well, thank you
Yeah.
for that. That was great.
Hey, Cheryl, so
Yes.
do you contact schools for your research or do they contact you? How does that relationship begin? And how do people even contact you to move forward if they want to do
Yeah.
what you're doing with them?
If you're interested in working with us, you can just go up to substantial.com and find us there. You can also find me on LinkedIn if you want to reach out to me directly. I'm happy to like connect with any folks at schools or in education. Um, it's just Sheryl Cababa. I'm the only one up there with that name, so you can find me pretty easily.
Love that.
And yeah, it oftentimes like we get connected to different schools and school districts through the client partners that we work with. And yeah, sometimes we're working directly with students, sometimes we're working with other organizations that work with schools. So it's kind of like a variety. But yeah, if anyone's at a school or school district and they're curious and talking to us about our work, please get in touch.
And also startups as well.
Yes, startups, yeah, ed tech developers.
Right.
Yeah, we work really closely with them, especially to kind of help them with kind of making their products more equity centered.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I've been doing some mentoring with some startups. So I am going to connect you after this
Oh, that's
with
awesome. I love it.
the lady that's working with them. So yeah,
Amazing. Thank you.
yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Thank
Well, we'll
you.
put all this information in the show notes for everyone to have access to. But yes, thank you so much for joining and giving us some insight into this fabulous work that you're doing to do better for education. I love it. And students specifically.
Too. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. You all asked the best questions.
Thank you for listening. And if you would like to stay linked up, be sure to follow us on Apple and Spotify and subscribe to us on YouTube.